moment. It's lovely to.
Certainly is. Certainly is. How are you, Ram?
I'm absolutely fine. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Before I start this conversation, for the benefit of our viewers, can I request you to give an introduction of who you are, what you do, and we can get our conversation started?
Yes, certainly. So my name is Paul Burrin. I'm Vice President of Product for Sage People at Sage. Essentially, Sage People is a global cloud HR and people management solution. It's designed specifically to help manage people and help HR teams in mid-sized organizations. It's an end-to-end solution built on Salesforce. And essentially, my job is to try to understand the requirements of our customers and to ensure that we can meet the sorts of requirements that contemporary growing companies need, or companies that are just trying to manage the people in the current climate in the day-to-day operations.
Brilliant, brilliant. I mean, when we were talking some time ago, I just wanted to get your take on well-being, and I loved what you said about well-being, and that's why I thought that prompted me to have this conversation. So before we go into the depths of it, I would like to just ask, what is your view on well-being?
I think that it's something which has gained a lot more prominence in recent years. Essentially, if you look at definitions of well-being, well-being is normally defined as being a state of being comfortable or healthy or happy. I think that that's a good sort of summary, but I think it's this sort of sense of being at ease and at peace with yourself and what you're doing and your whole life, really. And I think it's challenging because clearly it can be something which feels a little bit hard to define, because you're talking about feelings and a state of being. But at the same time, I think that it's become more and more critical for organizations and businesses to really understand what that means. And I think that this has all come to the fore most recently because of the pandemic. And now everybody is in a situation where we're all working typically very differently. There's different types of stress and concerns and challenges than what was in the old world, at least, in our term of the old normal. And so as a consequence of that, I think well-being has really been brought to the fore. Doesn't mean to say it wasn't there before, but I think it's got a new sense of urgency and purpose as individuals and organizations come to terms with, the new world that we're currently living in.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, isn't it? Earlier they used to talk about work-life balance. When you don't go out, your work is part of your life and life becomes part of your work. We've all become tolerant of the child running in between the Zoom conference or the occasional cat crossing the screen. So if you look at it, how do you think it has shaped the approach to well-being from a corporate perspective?
Well, I think the notion of individual well-being and corporate well-being are two very different things. And I think it's actually quite a fascinating question. So let's unpack this a little bit. If you think about individual well-being, as you know, Ram, there's a whole number of different components or aspects to individual well-being. And those aspects are dynamic. They're constantly changing. It's not fixed. Excuse me. So obviously there's physical well-being, which is, your physical state and physical fitness and those sorts of things. Then there's a range of others, mental well-being, emotional, spiritual, financial, social, and societal. These are all different examples of things that impact how an individual feels, their state of being comfortable or healthy or happy or just, as feeling balanced, in control, relaxed about things. And we all know that those different factors change and can change very quickly, and we all feel slightly different. You can wake up some mornings and you feel better than you did the day before. You may not feel as good for whatever reason, and therefore, it's quite complicated. But it's you have to think about this, I guess, as a state over a longer period of time, and looking at that from your own personal perspective. Corporate well-being, on the other hand, I think is something which is actually not really very clearly defined. And what I mean by that is that you could look at it in a couple of different ways. You can look at a corporation or a company as a collection of people, which ultimately it is, which arguably has a set of values and an approach to trying to solve a particular set of problems and do that profitably, and therefore add value to society and the world, because of that's essentially what it's doing. So this notion of corporate well-being could just be, well, is it just about this sort of collective state of the employees in the company being comfortable, healthy, and happy, which by extension of that initial argument would seem quite reasonable. However, when you then take a step back and say, well, if you look at a company and say, well, is this company doing well, then you suddenly realize that there's a whole series of other factors that come into this. So, for example, doing well often means, well, is it performing financially? Is it viable? Is it financially strong? Does it have a clear vision and purpose? Is it going to be a company that's got a strategy and a vision which is going to be around for a period of time, or is it something which potentially is only going to be a short term, and possibly for startups or even companies which are going through a lot of change? It may well be that they're not in a good state for different reasons. And would you say that therefore they were, you had corporate well-being in the sense the company as a business is performant? Because if you say, well, a particular company is struggling, it may not be in a good state financially, or it may be having products at the end of their life cycle and be in a position then that it's going to be struggling to survive. It could be that suddenly the market has moved and suddenly the technology base that they're using has been changed in some way, or the product base has changed significantly because of technical change. We're seeing that with the digital technology and the digital transformation that's ongoing at the moment. You suddenly realize there's a number of other factors which play out here. And I guess that raises, to me at least, a sort of quite an interesting question as to, well, how should we think about corporate well-being and how do we define it?
Okay, if you really look at it, then corporate well-being primarily is, if the company exists, then corporate well-being is definitely a thing to consider, because the end goal for a corporation is to make profits, right? Am I reading it correctly, or am I actually interpreting it totally differently? Because without performance, without profits, without purpose, without vision, well-being doesn't have a place, because if the company doesn't exist, corporate well-being doesn't exist. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, look, ultimately, if a company doesn't have the ability to make profits, then it can't survive financially. However, there's another dynamic to this, which says, well, and this is sort of fundamental, is ultimately that the only measure of corporate well-being? Is it actually only about finance? And I think that we're at an interesting inflection point in that you have to have a business which is financially viable to have a business which is sustainable. But if we look at this more broadly, then is it just about financial results and that what determines corporate well-being, or is it also about other things? So, for example, if you're in a situation where your business is making a lot of money, but it's doing it at the expense of how you treat your workers. And, a good examples are companies that have supply chains, for instance. You look at a company like Apple, for instance, where there's been, criticism over time as to its supply chain and the labor conditions in the supply chain, and the fact that, people aren't necessarily getting paid well and they're working, in sweatshops and that sort of thing. You see the same thing in the clothing industry as well, where some brands have been criticized in the same way. Or you look at a brand like Amazon, which has come under a lot of fire because of the way it treats its workforce as robots in the big warehouses that they're running. These are just a couple of examples, and it's not to say they're bad companies, but it raises a broader question as, can you just look at corporate well-being just through a financial lens, or do you need to look at it through other lenses, one of which would be the workforce itself and is that workforce being treated well, so that you have true corporate well-being of your workforce as part of the company being, well. And then I think there's another dynamic you could look at, which also says, well, is the company sustainable from an environmental point of view? Is it sustainable from, looking at it from the broader view of society? Is it a company that's really adding value, not just in terms of financial value, in that it's profitable, but is it using resources wisely, for instance? Is it sustainable from that perspective? Is it creating a lot of pollution? And in the context of climatic change and things, what's its carbon footprint? You get into a different range of dynamics, which, should we be looking at some of those factors as part of defining corporate well-being?
Okay. Now, if you really look at what an organization is, as you rightly said, it's a collection of people. So by focusing on well-being, ultimately you're focusing on this well-being to help them overcome their well-being challenges and then perform, right? That's the primary motive. And the market at the moment, I think, is 45 billion or 46 billion or $50 billion is strong, and it's growing at apparently 6% year on year. So with that much of investment going in, and now because of all this, it's accelerated well-being. Isn't it, right or wrong to measure the return on investment on a well-being initiative? What is your view on it?
I think that that's becoming increasingly clear, particularly as we've all been forced into, working very differently from normal. So for many of us, that means working remotely and being online the whole time. But for other companies, it could also mean, or businesses, it could mean, changing their business model. So if we look in, the hospitality industry or restaurants or those sorts of companies, many of these companies have had to change their business model. So, if you can't dine in, then you can only survive if you can provide some sort of takeout service. And so how do you flex your business in order to do that? But ultimately, I think you're right. It is critical that companies really thinking more about, how do they effectively manage people in this new way. And because of the change situation and because of some of the new challenges that have been brought to bear, organizations are now flexing. They're actually responding in very different ways. And I think there is a much more concerted effort to really think about, well-being of their employees, well-being of their workforce, because they're not in a position to manage them in the way they did, by everybody being, in offices, and therefore it's, in a sense, it's easier to get a sense check as to, how things are going. When everybody's remote and distant, and the only way you can really interact with them is digitally, then it suddenly takes on a very different stance. And I think that we're now starting to see, as a consequence of that, companies are looking at well-being and how you ensure that that is part of performance. And the notion then becomes about not just thinking about performance as, meeting your results, but how do you do this in an ongoing way, which is sustainable. So what I mean by that is it's not much good if you're forcing people to work very long hours and in a very focused way over very long periods of time, because we know that, people just can't do that. It isn't sustainable. You may have periods where it can be very intense and, everyone's working against deadlines or trying to get things done quickly for whatever reason. But ultimately, you're in a situation where you've got to balance that. So if it's very intense now, it's got to let up at some point. You've got to give people downtime so they can basically recover, if you will, from that intensity and get back to something which is more normal. And I think ultimately, well-being is really, from a performance point of view, is all about sustainable performance. How do you optimize that as a business over time?
Okay. So then I'm just unpacking what you said earlier. You talked about an individual well-being, and there are multiple facets to an individual well-being, right? Like your physical well-being, to your emotional, to your mental, to your social well-being. If that is not addressed, then I'm not going to be delivering what I am expected to deliver in my role, right? If you look at corporate well-being initiatives, they are more focused on the teams rather than individuals. And people might say, oh, it's very difficult to get to teams. But if the manager can actually do something about his or her team, they can actually layer it up so that the entire organization understands how each individual is and what their well-being needs are. So if you really look at what's happening, it's a one-size-fits-all approach that organizations are taking at the moment. What is your view on that? Am I right in saying that, or am I totally off the mark?
No, I think you make a very valid point. I think that I think we're in the very early days of organizations really thinking about well-being, and what corporate well-being actually means. Because you're right, it is layered. It starts with the individual, as we sort of touched on earlier. But then individuals don't work by themselves, as we know. Individuals work on teams and on multiple teams very often. We're all working on multiple projects, multiple teams. And when you look at that, then you then add another layer. What is the overall state of the team in terms of team well-being, which is obviously a collective view, but you then start thinking about it at that level. Teams then, work both in terms of the next layer, which you could think about either within divisions or larger groups in the business. Sometimes they work obviously across divisions, and then you've got the company as a whole. So I think it is very much layered, and I think it's also multifaceted, because when you start thinking beyond the individual and the individual well-being, and you start looking at different aspects of corporate well-being, whether it's team-based or broader, then there's other dynamics which play into this, which actually affect how individuals perform.
Okay. Now, you've interacted with various companies over a period of time, even in the recent past also. What is your view on how things are happening in the corporate space from in, can I call it Silicon Valley, where you are?
What, in terms of the current climate?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's really quite interesting. One can only view what one's own company is doing in terms of absolute knowledge, because one's closer to it. But you can obviously read about what other companies are doing. I think it's fascinating in that companies have changed very quickly, which is good, and in one sense is not necessarily unexpected. But I think it's been fascinating to see how companies have recognized, it's almost like step one. The first thing they had to do was, okay, if you're closing offices down or closing down workplaces, how are you going to keep the business going? And are people, how do you react? Are people equipped? Are they able to work from wherever they are, typically at home? Have they got the right technologies to do that? Are they used to being able to do that, or do they need help in terms of using new tools and working in different ways? For some, if you're in, for example, a tech industry, it's pretty easy because we've done this for years. So it's just doing it more of it, in the sense you're remote all the time as opposed to some of the time. But for other companies or other industries, that may be more challenging because it's newer, or for different people in the workforce, it could be newer if they've only worked in an office and haven't worked remotely from home before, or from a different remote environment. So I think the initial reaction was very interesting in terms of companies moving very quickly and then dealing with that. And the initial concern, beyond making sure that that people were set up and could work, was very much then about, well, are you okay? Are you physically well? Have you got any signs of illness or anything like that? Is your family well? So there was all that initial reaction, and it was very much about, have I got a job? Can I work from home? And is everybody okay? And that was like the initial set of reactions that happened. What has subsequently evolved, though, is that as we've become more used to having to work like this, then we've started to become more aware as to a couple of things. One is adjusting and responding to this new type of working and what that means. And typically, one of the things that I think pretty much all companies have found that is that it's actually quite exhausting having to work remotely online all the time. It's the online piece where you're working, digitally with some sort of video conferencing or video collaboration tool. And you're in a situation where the only way you can work is literally back to back to back, meeting after meeting after meeting, because this is the only way you can actually communicate and work with others. So whereas if you're in a physical environment, you tend to interact with people, even as you just walk down the corridor, or you're going to another meeting, or you're going to the cafe to get a coffee or whatever it might be, you bump into other people and you have side conversations, and you actually get a lot more done than you realize Whereas in this environment, that's not possible. So I think that that's become interesting to see how companies have recognized the need to help people work through that and work through what it also means, the point you made earlier, Ram, so well. There's a lot more flexibility and tolerance about how people are having to cope with this. So, if you've got animals wandering about, or you've got children, interacting, at times when in the past that just probably wouldn't have been tolerated and would seem to be completely unprofessional, we suddenly adapted and said, well, look, you just got to be realistic. I mean, people are having to work in an environment which was not designed, quite likely, for them to have to work in the way that we are. So they're doing the best they can, they're adapting the best they can. And therefore companies are having to say, well, okay, it's fine, so we don't mind if, if you've got, a child on a lap, long as, it's not making such a noise that the rest of the team can't understand what's going on and can't work, that's acceptable now. So I think we're seeing a whole series of new norms, and we just touched on a couple of simple examples, but there's many others that come into this, about, flexibility, adaptability, being much more empathetic about the situation. And I think all of these things are really important because that all contributes both to individual well-being, but also to corporate well-being in the context of the current environment.
Interesting. And when you're saying about that, it suddenly dawned on me, although coronavirus, we complain about it, it also has helped us get us back to being human, isn't it? It has demonstrated that we all crave for that human connection. And it's, what do you say?
Yeah, I think that's come about loud and clear. And I think you make a very good point, Ram, because if you think about the whole context of reopening, which is like the next phase, right? People are quite desperate to be able to try to get back to, the old world, shall we say, the old normal, because that was what normal has always been for us, okay, for many years. So I think that people are desperate to be able to get back. It is the human dynamic that's really becoming top of the agenda. But that's also creating, a sort of an additional challenge. So let me explain what I mean by that. I think it's twofold. First of all, just being human, wanting to connect with other human beings, be part of something, is part of the reason, why people want to get back, not so much to the office, but being able to get back to life, i.e. go out to a restaurant and have a meal, or be able to go to the movie theatre, or go and see a sports game or something, just do the stuff that we've always done. And suddenly that's like out of bounds. That's just not feasible because of the virus and the problems of it spreading worse or more dynamically than it has been. So there's one set of concerns about that, which is creating, a lot of frustration. And for some people, it's a big issue. There's a lot of people that don't have the ability to live with families or extended families, and they're on their own. And there's a lot of loneliness, even within families, because, people can't connect with other family, friends and relatives and things in the way they used to. So there's that piece of it. Excuse me. There's a second piece, though, as well, which is this notion of reopening, this whole strategy about, well, how do we start to reopen offices? Because we cannot continue to work as we are like this, either from an individual point of view, because long term it's just not sustainable. And secondly, it certainly isn't economically viable, which is the other big problem that's now coming in, as we all know. It's, what do you put as the priority? Is it trying to keep people completely safe or as safe as possible by isolating them away from the virus and its impact? But if you do that too long and the economy collapses, there won't be any work for people, and we can't, economies can't sustain themselves indefinitely without work happening. And so you raise a whole sort of separate set of problems. And I think this is the current state of play that we're in, is how do governments around the world, how do societies get the balance right between trying to manage the pandemic and doing the right things in terms of keeping people safe and well and enabling the healthcare systems to cope and cope with these spikes and the ongoing problems, hence all the concern coming up about the winter season in the Northern Hemisphere. And then at the same time, recognizing that somehow we've got to figure out how we do open things up and get the economy moving, but how do we adapt as we go through that process? And I think that's what everyone's trying to figure out.
Interesting, because I've always been wondering whether progress, the economic growth, is the right indicator of actual progress. Because if you really look at stats, I think 49 people or 52 people own 49% of the world's wealth. So if that is the case, then probably this is giving an opportunity for us to reflect on what is progress. Do we measure growth or do we measure progress? That's an interesting debate that needs to happen, but that's for a separate conversation. Now, from your experience in your organization, are there any examples that actually have stood out that think, wow, that's interesting from a well-being perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think Sage has done quite an amazing job in the sense that it's taken a broader view of well-being in the context of looking at this from an employee experience point of view and trying to think this through. And so, yes, it's doing a lot of really sensible things and managing, I think, incredibly well in terms of having, we've shut down all our offices. Everybody works remotely, everybody's online, and yet somehow we've managed to keep the business moving forwards. We've managed to, really make sure we're looking after customers and keeping customers at the front of what we're doing. So we're really trying to help. If we we serve lots of small businesses, and therefore, it's really important that, as there are so many small businesses and they're often the backbone of many economies, that, we try to help these small companies as best we can, as they in turn each try to manage their own current situation. So I think all of that's been good. But the thing that I think has been particularly interesting and great to see is that Sage is also very mindful of its employees. And therefore, it's put in place a number of different programs in terms of helping managers learn how to manage more online and dealing with this sort of thing. It's got supporting programs around well-being. It's got supporting programs in terms of, mental health. It's got support in terms of trying to do things like, helping people with exercise online through, online yoga classes and that sort of thing. So I think that, it's really trying to adapt really as best it can as a business, as a company to this new world, being aware of, a lot of these different sort of aspects of well-being from an individual point of view, because there's the recognition that, ultimately, if we don't keep our workforce, in good shape or in the best shape we can in the circumstances, if we aren't able to be more flexible, I mean, it's another thing as I think about it, just the way that many managers are being flexible about, getting work done. So, for instance, not insisting that people are necessarily working from 9 to 5, but if they've got situations at home where, for example, we've got many employees that are having to look after children and school children and do that over a sustained period of time whilst also trying to work.
That demands a lot of energy. That itself demands a lot of energy.
It's huge and very stressful and extremely tiring. Well, if companies and managers in particular can just be not just empathetic, but say, right, I get it. Okay, what can I do to help an individual have the flexibility to deal with whatever they've got to deal with? And it's sometimes just saying, okay, these are the key things I need you to get done in this time period, but how you manage to do that is entirely down to you. So if it means that, you're going to start your day early, you're going to take the middle of the day and you're going to deal with your children and school your children, and then you're going to put in some additional hours towards the back end of the day, that's fine. Just do what you have to do. We'll try and be as flexible as we can as a business, but I think ultimately it's down to managers and teams trying to understand, empathize, but work with individuals to try to ensure that they're, in the best place from a well-being perspective overall, so that the business in itself, is getting that enhanced well-being across the whole organization.
Brilliant. As always, it's great talking to you, Paul. And just to close it off, if you had to say 3 things that organizations need to look at from a well-being perspective, 3 pieces of advice, what would that be?
Well, just off the top of my head without thinking about it, I think the first thing is to recognize that well-being is something which is absolutely key to success. It's not a nice to have anymore, it's a must have. I think the second thing as part of that is to recognize that that's multifaceted. It's a lot of different dimensions to it, which makes it actually quite a complicated topic. But again, just appreciating the fact that, there are a lot of different factors involved and you need to look at this in a holistic way. And then I think the third thing is to be thinking about this as a business going forwards, if you look at the business today, you look at its current culture and its values and what's working and what's not, what things may need to change from the way that you used to do things to the way you now need to. So, for example, do your managers have the right emotional intelligence to really get the best out of people from a well-being point of view in this new world? Are you managing things like diversity and inclusion to really good effect? Because we know that that's become increasingly a concern that's being expressed across the globe. And ultimately, as we start to try to get back to some sort of normality and we get to try to reopen some of the physical workplaces that we've been in the past, how do you ensure that you're building trust and reassurance and fairness into what you're doing as you try to go back to the workplace, so that you can manage well-being, you can drive sustainable performance, but you can do it in a way which ultimately is going to be seen to be the right thing to do and the ethical thing to do from your employee's point of view.
Okay. Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. Pleasure as always. Brilliant.
Always good to talk to you, Ram. Really enjoy it, and catch up again soon, no doubt.